Okay, another Oski Studio and Blender tutorial. This one's going to be a little technical, wonky, but I'm going to address something that's been a frustration of mine for a while, and I've got some workaround that I think if you're trying to do this sort of thing with Blender, hopefully you'll appreciate, you'll find useful. Um, Let me just kind of jump right into kind of what I'm talking about. One of my challenges with using Oski Studio with Blender, um, inside of Blender, there's all sorts of neat ways to render things out. Colors, shaders, whatever. Inside of Oski Studio, there's really just one. Take the lines that it's given and draw them. And that's awesome. And I love oscilloscope music. But a frustration is if you think about a simple object like this cube inside of Blender, it looks nice and solid. There's a top face, there's a front face, there's this left side face. But what Oski Studio gets is the wireframe. So it just gets these edges. Okay. And so in Oski Studio, if we kind of rotate it, there's really sort of no baked in way to remove these back faces. And for this cube, it's not a big deal. You know, it's kind of a fun thing to watch spin. If I had a really complex scene or a complex object, then having the back lines show makes for sort of a challenging visual. It can get complicated. It can be hard to see which, you know, if this face here, is that really an object behind, or is it this front one? You know, sort of all the problems of vector graphics, right? So what I'm going to show you is some techniques that I've developed over the last few months using a Blender plugin called Animation Nodes, which allows you to remove or hide or shrink some of these back faces, some of these back edges, and sort of make for, in my opinion, a crisper visual. It's kind of easier to see what's going on. It also buys you some benefits sound-wise. This object, the way it's drawn now, has, you know, some extra lines, right here, right here, right here. And if you can remove them, they're also removed from the sound. And so it actually does is it allows you to have this object work in a wider frequency range. If there's too many lines, then even just one time around the whole drawing will be a relatively high frequency sound. And you've seen some of the really complex sounds are just super noisy and shrill and high pitched. If you can shrink away some of these unnecessary lines and kind of boil it down to the stuff you really want to see, you can have the sound come down in frequency and be more useful and have a sort of wider range of usefulness. So I think both of those are a good benefit. At least, you know, when I'm doing my music, that's what I find. So first things first, you don't need any sort of fancy plugins to fix this problem with this scene. If you have a cube, you know, you can just go in and edit out that back, right? So I'll pop in here, select that vertex, delete it, and let's see, connect here. I gotta rotate. This is Oski Studio. I didn't rotate it yet to the right angle, but there you go. So there's me solving the problem. Right, so this is the old sort of Hollywood solution of only show them what you want them to see, right? But this works great. This is a really simple answer to the problem. If I was just showing a field of cubes and I was from this angle and I was doing something else, then you're done, right? You know, so don't forget that the simple answer. So that's version 1. That's the free one. Let me open up a sort of more complex version to show you something that's more universally useful. This one, obviously, if you do rotate around, you start to see that the sort of back of the object is empty and missing, and etc. So it's good but limited. Okay, so we'll scoot this over. Let me open up a file I built here. All right, So it looks complicated. Bear with me here for a minute, and it's not too bad. So first things first, this object, let me kind of take this off of it. There's your object again, your cube. There it is in Austey Studio. This is a subdivision surface. This is a way to sort of increase the number of polygons in an object. Usually it's used as a starting point, and then you go in and you can modify those polygons so you don't have to draw extra lines. It sort of bakes them in for you. This version of it is sort of draws straight lines. This one sort of turns it into a curve, subdivides it as a curve, and you can see over here in Austey Studio it's sort of following along. By the way, I've turned Austey Studio all the way down so that we're really just focused on the visuals. Again, with this though, it's hard to tell, which is the front line and which is the back when you just look at this wireframe version. And I've got this sort of tricky cheat up here that allows you to do that. So first I'll show you how it works. Let me switch this guy over to sort of solid view. Take the cube away, put this on here. Oops. Plug this all back in. All right, there we go. Now it's working. Okay, so this is kind of a cool effect. What is going on, just sort of in layman terms, is that this original cube, let me switch this over to the sort of straight version of the cube. Here's that original cube. I'm taking this device here, which I named viewer, but is an empty, and sort of a Blender term for it. And what I'm doing is I'm saying any part of this cube, change the size of these faces based on the distance of that face from this empty, this little driver object. And so as you sort of move it around, it changes that shape. And here's your Austey Studio view of that. And I use this particular shape and this technique a lot in a song I did a while back called Attack Vector. It's got lots of cubes spinning and lots of different sort of cool Rubik's Cube sort of vibes going on. And what's really what's going on too is it's sort of hiding the back face, because the back face is too far away from this object. I'll tell you a little bit about what an empty is. An empty is not a mesh, but it's a sort of driver object. It's something you can put into your scene that allows you to sort of interact with meshes without messing with the mesh, right? So if you build this cool, a lot of times you'll see them if you look at Blender tutorials, you'll see people building this crazy complicated character, and then they'll use empties as sort of handles to move parts of that character around. And so instead of grabbing the character, you grab this invisible handle called an empty, and then you move it, and it just drives parts of that depending on how you rig it up. In this case, that's sort of what I'm doing. The cube is still there. There's your cube, right? And it's a complicated object. It's hard to see what's going on, just because there's so many faces from the back that are showing through. By switching it to this sort of view of it, what I'm saying is, okay, take that cube object, but for every face in the cube object, calculate the distance between that face, actually the center point of that face, and this empty. And then based on that distance, scale the size of that face, that little polygon, accordingly. And if it's too far away, scale it to 0. So the fact that there's stuff invisible, it's not really invisible. Well, it is invisible to this, but it's still there, right? Those objects are still there. They're just 0 scale. And so that's what I'm doing, is hiding them away with a 0 scale. But, if I put this empty up here, then guess what? I've hidden the back faces. Now, obviously, there's some back here that you might like to see. This technique is not based on the point of view of the viewer. It's based on the distance from the viewer. But it's pretty dope. I think it looks great. You can use this on lots and lots of different objects to have them come in and out, to scale them, to spin them, do all sorts of crazy animation with the pieces of the object. So let me walk you through how I built this inside of animation nodes. Just some background on animation nodes. It's a really powerful plugin. It's free. A guy named Jacques Luc, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it right, but he put that out a year or two ago. There are some other superpower users out there who are sharing tutorials on how to use animation nodes, and I'll put a couple links down below. And I've gained a lot from them, and they're just really generous with their knowledge on how to use Blender, but animation nodes in the Blender context. And I'd recommend that if you want to do some of this, that's how you get good at it, not by watching my stuff. But let me walk you through some of the basics of what the logic is of how animation nodes is working, because that applies to a lot of the sort of, I've got 3 different techniques here, and they all sort of have the same framework. All right, so let's go back to our original cube, and I'm going to put this back into our sort of solid mode. So animation nodes is a node-based programming language, and that sounds a little scary, but really what it is you can take parts of your Blender world and push it into these little nodes and tweak them. And you can actually tweak the original object, but in the case of the way I'm using animation nodes here, I'm taking the original object as sort of a raw input, and then I'm calculating and translating and modifying the mesh of the original object, but then I'm outputting it as a new object. So the original mesh is unchanged, but there's a new object that's sort of a variant of that original object. So one step at a time here. Here's the original object, the cube. I'm asking animation nodes to grab the object mesh data, which is all of the vertex locations, all the edges, which is sort of connections between vertices, and all of the polygons, which is connections between 4 vertices to make a face. And in this case, polygon centers. I'm not using that here. Use modifiers. This tells it, don't just take the original cube, but also apply this modifier, this subdivision surface modifier that I tossed on it. So it's not just taking the original sort of 8 corners, it's taking all 96 faces, right? All right. So then the next step here is prepare polygon transformation. It basically says, okay, there's some polygons here defined by these vertices. I'm going to transform them. Give me a second, I'll tell you what it's going to be. And then here's the transform polygon. So this sort of sets it up. This thing is the transformation that I'm applying. In this case, I'm calculating the distance from that viewer object, this guy here, right, to each of the locations of these objects, which is these polygons, and I'm scaling them. And that's, that's the thing that we're doing, is scaling. And the term that animation nodes, and I think Blender generally uses, is fall off. So it's basically, there's an effect that this transformation has, and that effect falls off over distance, point distance fall off, right? And so in this case, it's what it says is at the end of that transformation, I'm going down to 0 scale. So that's why it vanishes away. So when we look at this sort of modified object, these objects here are outside of the range of this fall off. The range of the fall off is 2.67, the way I've defined it here. If I made it bigger, there would be more of them still visible, still not all the way down to the end. Made it smaller, obviously it shrinks. It has a shorter range of effect. Fall off width, the way to think about this is it's 100%, then some fall off range, and then it's 0%. And so the distance from here to the 100%, some fall off range, 0. So the distance from here to here is at 2.55 in this case. The fall off width is this distance, is like how, over what duration does that fall off occur. If you make this 0, right, it's either in or out. You don't have this sort of scaling up. And that's kind of a cool effect, right? So if you look over here, right, it's kind of coming in and going out, and things are appearing and disappearing. When I add some width, though, they kind of phase in, they phase out, right? So that's what's going on there. And so then, sorry, there's that transformation that's here. And then it says, oh, transform the polygons. How do you want me to transform them? Using this point distance fall off and an offset matrix, which is basically it's not just one transformation, but I'm applying this transformation to every one of these 96 polygons that make up this object, and then apply a scale, with all these sort of variables we talked about. Okay, so here's that transformed set of polygons outputting into creating a new mesh here, and then I'm dumping it into this new object called target, and that's this guy here. So when I show and hide target, it's that modified version of it, and then the original cube is still there, right, unmolested. So that allows you to sort of make a really cool complex object and then run one of these on it to do whatever you want and still keep the original cool object unaffected. Another neat thing that allows you to do is I can make a duplicate sort of instantly of this modified object, or I can have a different modification applied to this different object. So if you like the grid plugin that's inside of OSCE Studio, you can have 2 or 4 or 8 or whatever. I can sort of whip up one of those right here, put in second object in, and just moving it. So there's my second object. There's my first object. I have target and target 001. And again, if I take this viewer, as I move the viewer, oops, select the viewer, move the viewer, you can see that there's 2 versions of this object. They're in different places, and I could rotate this, right? And I can have kind of a pattern, really whatever I want. I'm inside of Blender, right? But over here in OSCE Studio, we could have kind of a different spin going on here, right? That's these guys interacting somehow. And oh, by the way, you go all the way out here, and everything is 0, and so it puts points, which is kind of a fun little side effect. All right. So let's turn that back off and reset. Let's get back in. I'm just going to go ahead and delete that guy for now. Keep it simple. Back into the right zone. Okay. There's your object. So this is sort of a simple way. Again, I haven't officially hidden the back faces. What I've done is I've hidden things that are a certain distance away. So this is very similar to the Z-Clip feature that's inside of OSCE Studio. It hides things that are more than a certain number of units away. But this, again, it's a quick way to do it. I will save this Blender project, by the way, so you guys can grab it and play with it yourselves. All right, so that's version 1. This is sort of a simple approach, but really effective, and frankly, you can go all day with these sort of distance-based transformations. Well, let me switch over to number 2 here. You know what? I'm going to pause, and we'll do that in part 2. Okay.